ready to start? Okay. I'm Marilyn Ruschemeyer, and as a research professor at the Watson Institute, I chair the Institute's lecture series on European politics. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Timothy Snyder, again to Brown University, where he earned his bachelor's degree with concentrations in European history and political science. He received his doctorate from Oxford University in 1997. Timothy Snyder is the Housum Professor of History at Yale. Working mostly on Eastern Europe, he has quickly become one of the leading American historians and public intellectuals. His book titled Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, has transformed our understanding of the European mass murders of the 20th century. It received the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Hannah Arendt Prize, and the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding. Today's lecture on Ukraine and Russia in a fracturing Europe will give us his analysis of the developments since the uprising in Kiev, the topic of his last lecture here at the Watson, if we remember correctly. Okay, Professor Snyder, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So the premise, the title is Ukraine and Russia in a fracturing Europe. And the way that I would like to think about the title, the way that I'd like to think about the topic is not just to ask about a status quo and what it looks like when it falls apart, but to inquire instead about the fracturing agent. So is there in fact something which is making things fall apart, right? Is it just that the center is not holding, or are there forces at work which help the center not to hold, right? Are there reasons why that falcon is getting lost in that widening jeer and can't hear the falconer? So my premise is going to be to take the question as a question about agency or a question about causality. I'm not just going to set Russia and Europe in place against this Europe which is falling apart, but I'm going to ask if the predicament of Russia, the predicament of Ukraine, the predicament of Europe have something in common, and whether that something might be a kind of explanation. So one way to pose the question, or one way maybe to clarify the question in terms of political theory, would be to talk about the state. So if you look at the title, if we think about the title again, Russia, Ukraine, fracturing Europe, none of these entities, and I'm just saying this as a way to kind of warm up for the explanation, none of these entities is a state in an unproblematic way, which is one of the reasons why I think attempts to explain the last 5 years, which is going to be what I try to do, in terms of conventional political science or national relations theory, tend to founder. Now, why am I saying these places are not states in a conventional way? Well, what I want to claim, I'm going to try to defend this, what I want to claim is that statehood is actually a question here rather than an axiom. So normally when we wander into an international relations problem, we assume that statehood is the thing that is fixed and other things might be in motion, like maybe leadership changed or the environment changed, or maybe there are some new interests, maybe there's a new institution. But we tend to assume that the state is somehow fixed. But what if the state is the thing that's in motion, right, both practically and theoretically? Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with Russia, right? Now, Russia's image of itself is that it is the stable state in the region, right? Other places come and go, you know, other states are artificial, they're fractured, they're historically illegitimate, they're decadent, whatever it might be, there are all kinds of adjectives. Other places all have qualifications. Russia has no qualification, right? Russia simply exists, it's been there forever, it will be there forever. Now, what I would want to suggest is that, in fact, this very language of security and stability and continuity, right, this very attempt to put the existence of Russia outside of any possible brackets, reflects a very real insecurity. Russia actually lacks one of the fundamental elements of a normal state. And I don't mean like a terrific democratic rule of law state. I mean a state. And that basic thing which it lacks is a succession principle. Okay, so I'm talking about something very, very, very basic, right? A problem in political life since as long as political life has been recorded. In 2011, the people who currently run Russia chose not to have a succession principle, right? So that's one way, it's one way of characterizing faking elections demonstrably, and making it clear that what you're going to do indefinitely is have fake elections and do it in a demonstrative way, right? What that does is not just that that's not democracy, right? It's not just that that is managed democracy or sovereign democracy or whatever Sorokov wants to call it. It is the absence of a succession principle, right? And everyone, of course, in Russia understands this, but it's not something you can articulate, right? The question of what happens after Putin is not one that you sort of whistle happily down the street as you're walking down central Moscow, but it is in the back of everyone's mind, I think it's fair to say. Right, so you're now in a situation where there's no clear succession principle, and that's Russia's basic problem as a state. And I want to suggest that that's a source of a lot of energy, right? That's a source of a kind of ideological opportunity, and I'm going to try to characterize how ideology comes in and fills that gap. Okay, Ukraine in 2013. Right? Russia in 2011 fakes elections, denies itself a succession principle. And then it begins to tell a story in 2012, and especially in 2013, about something called Eurasia, where Eurasia is going to be a substitute, a replacement, an alternative to the European Union. Eurasia is an economic organization. It's meant to include Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, some other places, but it's also an idea. And the idea, as far as one can make out, is that the European Union, rather than being progressive, is fundamentally decadent, right? That Russia, rather than being decadent, is fundamentally sound, and that the destiny, the direction of European history is not where we think it's actually towards Russia. Now, this idea is consistent with the suppression of democracy in 2011, because when you suppress democracy in 2011, what do you say? You say, these protesters were supported from the outside. You say, these people are middle-class people who have been contaminated by their contact with Europe. This is not an authentic movement from within. This is fundamentally something caused by NGOs, civil society, European money, and Hillary Clinton personally. She also comes into the mix. She gave the signal, to quote Putin's famous words at the time, to bring about these protests, right? So when you're suppressing elections and you're denying yourself your own succession principle, you are simultaneously saying, this is not our problem. This is something which came from the outside. So in Ukraine in 2013, the events in Ukraine in 2013 have to be seen in the context of a kind of political crisis which is already underway in Russia. Because what happens in Ukraine in 2013 is almost too much like what happens in Russia in 2011, right? What happens in Ukraine in 2013 is that when the Ukrainian government switches its own policy, under Russian pressure and after the offer of an awful lot of Russian money, when the Ukrainian government switches its own policy from, yes, we want an association agreement with the European Union, to no, we no longer want an association agreement, then people protest. And they protest in the name of what? Europe, right? And who are they? They're the middle classes, right? It's exactly the kind of scenario which the Russian leaders almost pretended happened in 2011 in their own country. It actually does happen in 2013 in Ukraine. And when it's happened, the Russian narrative about it, right, by which I mean both the media and the leaders, is that this is not authentic, this comes from the outside, right? This is Hillary Clinton. This is the Obama administration, this is Victoria Nuland, this is NGOs, this is international civil society. Whatever it can be, it's not Ukraine, right? And along the way, it's suggested very strongly from President Putin on down that Ukraine isn't really a society. I mean, Ukrainians logically cannot be protesting because there isn't such a thing as Ukrainians. Ukraine and Russia are one people, right, says the president of the Russian Federation, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to say, right? I mean, Russianist colleagues sometimes, minimize this because they kind of think it themselves. But if I were to stand up and say that Russia and Canada, that America and Canada are one people, right, that would be strange. And it is actually a strange thing for a head of state to say. But Putin is saying this in late 2013. And it's part of the rationale for why what's happening in Ukraine must come from abroad, because it can't logically be coming from inside Ukraine because there is no Ukrainian nation, there's no Ukrainian society. Which brings us to the third actor, right? Fracturing Europe, Europe's not a state, right? That's not a, everyone knows that. Europe is not a state. It's a collection of states, and it's a collection of states which exerts a kind of influence or kind of attraction on both Russia and Ukraine, to various extents at various times to various peoples. But what it's not is not a state. So what this all suggests is that if we want to try to get our minds around these events, or if there is any legitimate theoretical way to address these events, it can't start by assuming the existence of the state. It has to start somewhere else. And to take a step further, and here is where I'm going to go a place which I hope is new for you and innovative. If we're going to find an idea which could be behind this, right? If we're going to find the agent of disillusion, the force that's doing the fracturing, the thing which is breaking the status quo, it's going to have to be some kind of idea which is comfortable, right, with the lack of a state. And the proposal that I'm going to make, is that the idea which is behind all of this, or which in some way has some causal force, is fascism. Okay, I hope if you've fallen asleep already, now that's the point where you're supposed to wake up, is when I say fascism, right? You're all cued to wake up when people say fascism. Okay, so now why would this be a reasonable way to proceed? I've already suggested one reason, which is the absence of the state, or the fluidity of the state, or the character of the state as a question rather than an answer, right? Fascism is comfortable with that. Fascism is comfortable with orders being done and undone, with states rising and falling, right? Most of the ways we look at the world are not comfortable with states rising and falling. Fascism is. Another reason why, and this might be a reasonable way to try to explain Russian behavior in the last 5 years, is that other ways of trying to do so don't work. Right? So if you try to explain, I mean, you can do this empirically. You can ask what political scientists predicted any of this stuff, right? But you can ask, one by one, how is what Russia done in the last 5 years realistic, right? So if you're a realist, you would say Russia is should balance between Europe and China, and instead what it's done is it's tried to undo the European side, making itself much more vulnerable to China, right? Not very sound as classical realism. Or if you care about institutions, you believe that laws are real. Why has Russia, in invading Ukraine and annexing Crimea, challenged, perhaps even undone, the fundamental norm of international law, right, of territorial sovereignty? Why would you do that when you have the longest land border in the world, right? It's an odd thing to do. Or let's say you're an international relations person, you think economics matter, right? Well, then why did Russia imperil its trade relations with what is and what must be its major trade partner, the European Union? It's hard to explain Russian behavior along any of these classical lines. Something else, I think, has to be going on. Now, when I say fascism, I mean immediately, the dogs start to salivate, right? What do I mean when I'm enunciating this word? Why am I bringing this word up? Usually, when we talk about fascism, we're in the midst of making some kind of historical analogy. We are asking, is Trump like Hitler, right? It's more like Mussolini is the answer, but is Trump like Hitler, right? Like when we say fascism in the West, what we're usually doing is throwing ourselves back towards a historical analogy. If we say fascist in Russian or Ukrainian, we're usually calling somebody a bad name, right? And both of those acts are sort of empty. What I want to try to do is suggest something else. What I want to try to do is, oh, by the way, Trump is going to come back into this story by the end in a different way, right? In a non-name-calling way. Well, maybe I can't quite promise that, but Trump is going to come back into this story, and I hope in an interesting way before it's all over. Okay, what do I mean? What I mean is that there is, in fact, a fascist geopolitical thinker who has been revived in Russia in the 21st century. Now, here, we come across, first of all, something very interesting, because I'd ask you to think, how many major forgotten 20th century political theorists have been revived in the 21st century, right? Can you think of one? And if you can, you're helping me, because in my opinion, there aren't any. And I don't mean someone like Carl Schmitt, who admittedly is very, very popular now, but Carl Schmitt was never forgotten, right? Can you think of someone who was a major thinker who was totally forgotten and then has been revived and has become important. Okay, what do I mean by important? Now here we hit the classic problem of influence, right? Influence, how can you know that ideas influence people? Which I'm not going to solve in this talk. I am just going to toss at you a few bits of evidence which I hope are intuitively convincing. One sign that a thinker might be influential upon a political class is that when there is a reading group, for example, in the Kremlin, and they read his books, right? That's one sign. These are all things that happen, by the way. Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when all of his works are republished in huge editions over a short period of time. That happens. Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when you go and you exhume his body from a faraway country, bring it back to your country, bury it with full military honors, and have the Patriarch of Moscow give a long speech about it. Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when you go to America, buy the archive, physically bring it back to Moscow, right? Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when the head of state regularly lays flowers on the new grave. Another sign that the thinker might be influential is when the head of state cites the thinker every time he does something truly extraordinary, right? So I cannot solve this influence question, right? I can't go from beyond correlation to causality, but these are correlates which I take to be highly suggestive. Who is the thinker that I'm talking about? The head of state is obviously Vladimir Putin. Who is the thinker that I'm talking about? The thinker that I'm talking about is a man called Ivan Ilyin. Ivan Ilyin, right? Does that mean anything? Yeah, okay, right? Does that mean anything? Well, okay. So Ivan Ilyin was an extraordinarily, actually, interesting thinker. And I want in this part of the talk, we've now reached kind of the middle. What I want to do in this part of the talk is to try to give his ideas a certain shape. Because what I don't want to do, I don't want to make the move of just saying he was a fascist. Okay. I mean, because you can show that he was a fascist, but that in a way doesn't answer our question, right? It doesn't answer our question of why he's significant, why he's read now, why he may make a difference. You know, it doesn't answer the question even what is fascism, right? So an easy 500-word essay would be to prove that he was a fascist, which could be done and has actually been done. But what I want to try to do instead is give you just at least a preliminary sense of what his ideas were and how they held together. So he was born in 1883. He dies in 1954. He's a kind of classic figure of the late Russian Silver Age. He comes of age, studies. He's in Moscow. He's from a noble family. He studies in Moscow. He studies with the liberals, right, with Trubetskoy. He himself, like so many people, is left-leaning, even revolutionary in his youth, which of course later he does not want anyone to know about. He does radical things like defend freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. He doesn't throw any bombs, as far as I know, but he does hide bombs for people who do throw bombs. So he has this youthful leftist experience. But what we're concerned about is his right-wing philosophy, and his right-wing philosophy has a couple of really interesting parts. The first is that he is a right-wing Hegelian, right? So he's a right-wing Hegelian. So most of the Hegelians that we think about usually are left-wing Hegelians, right? Or the Marx, right? So what the left-wing Hegelians do with Hegel is they make Hegel about the future and they legitimize revolution as opposed to being chiefly about the past, as Hegel thought, and leading towards a state. Marx then takes left-wing Hegelianism and says it's not about ideas, but it's about the modes of production. Ilyin is a right-wing Hegelian. He accepts that there's a dialectic. He accepts that there's a spirit, which is quite clear is God, which should be working itself out in history. But here he makes an interesting move. He says, not that God is dead, but God is feeble. God is actually unable to work his way out completely in history, and therefore the struggle between good and evil, between spirit and evil, has to be carried out by the hands of men, right? And then in particular, he says, and this is where things get kind of interesting for contemporary politics, he says, one of the signs of God's weakness is the existence of the middle class. So where many liberals and even many Hegelians would see the middle class as something progressive, he says the middle class is the existence of the middle class, which for him is without morals, without political courage, totally worthless, right? He's one of many political thinkers of the time and place who just hate the bourgeoisie while belonging to it. He thinks that the middle class is evidence of God's weakness. So it follows from this that in practice, in the great struggle between good and evil, people have to make choices. They have to decide what's evil. Okay, which leads to the second thing, which is interesting about his philosophy. I can't make it as interesting as it actually is, which is that he was also a kind of Chekist of God. That's a phrase I'm stealing from his enemies in the 1920s. He was a kind of right-wing Leninist. So where Lenin says about Marx, we can't allow the forces, the changes in means of production just to work themselves out. We have to kind of leap ahead, and it's going to be the party and the intellectuals who say when we're ready. What Ilyin says is that you can't really trust the peasants to know when an important revolutionary, counter-revolutionary moment has arrived. It's the intellectuals who know, what God actually wants. And he goes into great detail about how you figure out what God wants. I mean, extraordinary detail. It makes like our American contemporaries seem really shallow on this point of listening to God. Ilyin studied with Husserl, if that means anything to anyone. Husserl was an extremely important influence on him, but his understanding of Husserl was he used the phenomenological reduction to hear God. Right? So he writes hundreds and hundreds of pages about the experience of hearing God. But for our purposes, the important thing is that it puts the intellectual and Ilyin personally in a position of privilege where he decides. I mean, he actually does decide what is good and what is evil, and when we have to act. And in making these arguments, I mean, I can't resist saying this. He goes to extraordinary lengths. Like he gets into texts which you would think one would not engage with, like for example the Gospels. Okay, so he gets into the Gospels and actually debates the idea of loving thy enemy, right? And with tactics which might seem either legalistic or or casuistic, depending upon your preference, he makes the argument at great length that Jesus did not actually, when Jesus said love your enemies, he didn't mean love all your enemies. He meant love your personal enemies, but not the enemies of God. Right? And who decides who the enemies of God are? Well, Ilyin himself decides who the enemies of God are. And who are the enemies of God? The Bolsheviks. Okay? So in Ilyin's account, which is not so different from many white thinkers, from many people who resisted the revolution in the early 1920s, Bolshevism is not a fundamentally political movement. It's fundamentally metaphysical. It's fundamentally the release of Satan upon the earth. Right? Satan walks the earth in the form of Bolshevism. This is not metaphorical. He means this quite literally. Evil is here, and only men can resist evil. How can men resist evil? Men can resist evil by carrying out fascist coup d'etat. Okay? So then the next step in the thought is to endorse Mussolini and his coup d'etat in Italy as being chivalrous, as being necessary, right? As being correct, as being the only thing that could be done. If one does not support the chivalrous, he gets this chivalry thing directly from Mussolini. If you do not support the chivalrous struggle against the devil, I quote Ilyin, you are yourself the devil, right? So very strong, Old Testament style ways of seeing this struggle. So fascism, says Ilyin, and I like this very much. He says that fascism is the redemptive act of patriotic arbitrariness, which is actually not a bad definition of what fascism is, right? It's arbitrary, it's patriotic, and in the end it's meant to be redemptive. Okay, so Ilyin, when he's making these arguments, is in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. He has a long stay in Italy, but for the most part he's living in Germany in the 20s and 30s. You will not be surprised to learn that when Hitler comes to power in 1933, Ilyin also defends Hitler. He says Hitler is misunderstood. He says the Western press, and especially the Jewish press, is too hard on Hitler. Even the Russian immigrant press, he says, is too hard on Hitler. One has to understand that fundamentally the stakes are good and evil, Bolshevism and anti-Bolshevism. Hitler, he says, has granted European culture a stay of execution. So long as Hitler and Mussolini are in power, European civilization has a chance of surviving. Like many fascists, he equates Jews and Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks and Jews, and therefore approves of Hitler's discrimination against Jews, right down to approving the definition of a Jew by way of blood. Okay, now, that is just by way, all of that is just by way of establishing Ilyin as a kind of fascist, right? I mean, there were many, many fascists in the 1920s and 1930s. These views are not particularly exceptional in the 1920s and 1930s. I just want to have them in the background so they can be clear. Because what's most important for us is the way that Ilyin then later, in Swiss exile after the war, writes a short summary of all of his views. But in the late 40s and early 50s, he writes a short book called Our Tasks, which is a collection of political pamphlets. And it is this book which is first re-released in Russia in the early 1990s and has an immense career. And it's this book which we know that Vladimir Putin has read, along with a number of other people. And what Ilyin does in post-war Switzerland is that he sets out a kind of theory of fascist domestic and foreign policy. Now, he's in Switzerland, I can't resist saying, being supported by an American millionaire. That's like one, like there's a whole list, like when you canonize a thinker, like there are automatically a whole lot of things that you forget. Like one of the things you forget about Ilyin, if you're like the Russian elite now, is that he was in psychotherapy with Freud personally, daily, and that's how he missed the First World War. So rather, he couldn't be mobilized because he and his young wife went to Vienna to have daily psychotherapy with Freud, which is sort of extraordinary, like for a whole list of reasons. And one of them is that he was a graduate student at the time, right? And like as someone who has graduate students, I just can't help but think of the wonderful luxury of being able to say, you know, I think what you should do this spring is go to Freud and have psychotherapy with him personally for the entire spring. Why don't you just do that? Anyway, but the second thing would be that Ilyin was supported by the money of an American millionaire while he was in exile. That would be the second thing, which no one is going to say on a Russian talk show. So Ilyin, writing in Switzerland, takes a step back, crystallizes his views, writes these short articles, and makes the following case for fascism. Now remember, this is after the Second World War, right? After the Second World War, when not for everybody, but for many people, fascism had been discredited, if not by its evil, then by its defeat. This is after the Second World War. The case he makes has four parts. The first, it begins with innocence. Ilyin steps back and he says, Russia as a nation is fundamentally innocent. These are the parts that as a historian are really the hardest to read, because the way he describes Russian history is so unbelievably and I think deliberately naive. But of course he does issue a kind of methodological proviso. What he says is that Russia, the history, he says, is objective, quote, and pure, quote, regardless of what the actual contingent facts might be. So there might be facts which interfere with his telling of Russian history, but that's not important. The way that Russian history is fundamentally innocent. Russia has a virgin birth. So, you know, the Russianists in the crowd will be aware of the so-called Norman controversy, like were there Scandinavians or were there not Scandinavians? The answer is there were lots of Scandinavians for a very long time. But Ilyin is committed to the idea of a virgin birth of Russia. So the Slavs brought into being Russia all by themselves. He's also committed to the idea of an immaculate empire, that the city of Moscow became the largest state in the history of the world territorially while fighting only defensive wars. And he goes through every single battle that Russia ever fought. No, literally, over 1,000 battles, and characterizes every single one of them as defensive, right? And so Russia goes from being a village, actually just a bit of forest, to being this empire, while facing what he calls, quote unquote, 1,000 years of suffering, while facing, quote unquote, endless continental blockade from Europe. The second idea, and you won't be surprised, the second idea is that the nation is organic. So, which he says over and over and over again. I won't belabor it. This is not a category which I'm imposing on the documents. This is a word which screams out of his writings. Russia is organic. You can't, he says, take it apart. You can only dissect it, right? Russian culture is organic, fraternal, which means that anyone who lives on Russian territory, even if they're not Russian, which is a possibility he really doesn't like to admit, but when he does, he says, they will be automatically brought into Russian culture because Russian culture is organic, it's fraternal, and so there can't be national problems in Russia. It's logically impossible for there to be national minorities, a term he always puts in quotation marks. It's logically impossible for there to be Ukrainians, a term he also puts in quotation marks, because if you're in a Russian empire, a Russian state, you're automatically brought into this organic unity. Okay. And then finally, Russia is a country, and this is where things get really beautiful. I mean, they do in a way get beautiful. Russia is about love. Okay? Russia's about love. Russia's about love. It's about, when he's writing philosophically, the term that he uses is spirit, duch. So in Russia, so in the West, and in the West, people don't have, you've heard all this before, people don't really have a spirit, they only have an idea of an individual good, but in Russia, there's a national spirit which allows people to interpenetrate. and to see to see good collectively. When he's writing religiously, he talks about heart. Russians have heart. Europeans do not have heart. Here, I'm not actually simplifying very much. It's a pretty drastic conflation. He says that there's no distinction between religion and national identity. He says in a striking sentence among many. He says, "The nation is not God, comma, but it draws its strength from God." So he denies there's any tension whatsoever between Christianity and Russia. Where does this lead politically? Here he's very explicit. Again, when he's in the religious mode, he says this a couple of times, my prayer is a sword and my sword is a prayer, right? In other words, religion, this business of love, right, heart, spirit, carves out a certain territory, it marks a territory on a map, and that is the territory of love, right? The rest of the world's a territory of anarchy and evil. And when he defines this in a less religious modus, he sounds very much like Carl Schmitt. He says the definition of politics is the definition and neutralization of the enemy. That's what politics is, right? So in Russia, you have one zone, and the rest of the world, you have another zone, which is inherently hostile to Russia. Now, the example, Exhibit A, of how the world is hostile to Russia, in all of his writing is Bolshevism, which he does not, he does say Russians should take responsibility for it, but he thinks fundamentally Bolshevism as a result of foreigners and non-Russians. It's the reason, it's like the latest example of how the West is always against Russia. Okay, what does this recommend? And now you'll begin to feel the contemporary resonances if you read about Russia, or if you know Russia, or if you're from Russia. What does this recommend for domestic politics? Eileen says there should be a leader, right, a capital L type leader. He sometimes calls him a national dictator. There is no mechanism for how this person will be chosen or for how this person will be succeeded, right? This is the old leader principle from fascism, which says the problem that basically you need Aphrodite coming out of, Zeus's skull. The person has to appear on the scene, as Eileen explicitly says, not from history. The person has to be unhistorical, right? And when he's trying to characterize this, he writes things like, this person will be the living organ of Russia, the instrument for self-redemption. And who is this person? The Russian patriot who leads Russia to salvation, right? So these are the criteria of who this person is going to be. This leader, and Eileen elucidates this in a long book about a future Russian constitutional structure, should be the head of the army, the only executive, the only legislator, the head of the courts, right? So everything is going to be concentrated in this one person. His correction has a couple of corrections to pre-war fascism. One of them is that he doesn't think there should be a one-party state. He thinks there should be a zero-party state, right? There shouldn't be any parties at all. He very much doesn't like political parties. He thinks political parties can only be vessels for foreign influence. He thinks that civil society as such is negative, right? Civil society can only exist in its contact with foreign bodies, and that is inherently harmful for Russia. And he retains his hostility to the middle classes. The middle classes should be at the very bottom of the pyramid. He defines a kind of corporatist structure in which the head of state, this leader's at the very top, and then you go down, 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 and at the very bottom you have the middle classes. They can exist, but they should not be allowed to have any political influence whatsoever, right? So the way the middle class has been treated since 2011, the way civil society has been treated since 2011, and the ritual character of democracy. So I almost forgot. Eileen says there should be elections, but there shouldn't be parties, or if the parties are there, they should only be there for ritual decorative purposes. The election should be public, right? So you should be in public saying who you're going to vote for, and then you should record your vote on a piece of paper which you sign, right? So the purpose of the elections is just to ritualize support for the leader. What does this imply for foreign policy? And now we're getting even closer to the present. What Eileen does in all of this work, which I hope you find inherently interesting, because I certainly do, but even if you don't, what does this mean for the present? Well, it helps us understand what Eurasia is. The word Eurasia, whenever it's pronounced, I think it's one of these words which leads to an awful lot of confusion. Eileen helps us to see what Eurasia fundamentally is. Eurasia is fundamentally the dialectical resolution of the old tension in Russian thought between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. right? What is a Russian Westernizer? And I say this with hesitation because like the Russian historians in the crowd, and they'll scrub my ears later. But a Westernizer is someone who believes that Russia is fundamentally on the same historical path as the West, but just a couple steps behind. So politically, these people are usually liberals or socialists. There's progress. There's only one route to progress. Just some people are further along. A Slavophile is a pluralist. A Slavophile says there may not be progress. There may not be routes to progress. There are essentially different cultures in the world or civilizations. Russia is one of those cultures. Politically, that can make you a conservative. It can also make you a certain kind of revolutionary because you can think, well, our culture has the source of a utopia inside it, but it's different from a Westernizer, right? What is a Eurasianist? A Eurasianist is a person in the 1920s and 1930s, and Ilyin is the main one who resolves this tension. What a Eurasianist says is, the West is not actually about progress and enlightenment and liberalism and parliamentarism and democracy. That is all an artificial incrustation, right? The suggestion, or sometimes just the bald claim, is that it's a Jewish artifice, right? But the West is not actually inherently, organically associated with progress, liberalism, enlightenment, and so on. Those things can be stripped away from the West and should be stripped away from the West. And the people who've shown how that can be done are the fascists, right? So if the West returns to itself and becomes a kind of commonwealth, right, a kind of plural commonwealth of different fascist or maybe just national populist states, then Russia has a place in Europe, right? Then there is no tension between Russia and everyone else because Russia and everyone else are basically the same, right? So Ilyin is not a Slavophile. He doesn't think that Russia is separate from Europe, right? But he's also not a Westernizer because he's not a liberal. He's a Eurasianist who says that we're all basically, let's admit it, we're all basically fascists, right? And if we will all just admit that, then there is no need for there to be this artificial division between East and West. Now, he solves this problem intellectually. He also solves it in his person, right? Ilyin is basically a German philosopher who writes in Russian, right? He writes his dissertation about Hegel. His most important influence was Husserl. He gives most of his speeches in German. He writes in German as much as he writes in Russian. All of his major ideas are in some way in German rather than Russian debates. His mother was German. His mother tongue was German. You know, when he does psychotherapy, what language is he doing psychotherapy in with Freud as a very young man? In German, of course, right? He's very intimately a German. In 1915, when he's struggling with the war and the fact that he's not fighting in it, he says, the inner Germans are bothering me more than the outer Germans, right? The inner Germans, a very nice phrase. So, and then he lives his whole life, his whole adult life, well, from the age of 39 forward, he lives most of his adult life in German-speaking countries, right? And he is comfortable with a certain kind of Europe. It's not that he's not, he just thinks that Europe has to be nudged along to look slightly differently. Okay, so that's Eurasianism. How does that relate to the Eurasianism of today? And here's where we have to make the one jump, or where I think the Russian thinkers of today, including the head of state, have made a certain jump. So Ilyin dies in 1954. He's writing right up until then. And when he's talking about fascism, right, he's talking about what's normal not just for Russia, but for Europe. And he thinks that when he looks around in Europe, I mean, maybe 1954 is about as late as you can possibly think this. He looks around Europe and he says, fascism is normal, right? And what are his examples? Spain and Portugal, right? Franco and Salazar, right? This is the way that Europe is going to be. This is the way Russia is going to be. This is normal. Now, historically, you know, we know the problem with that, right? So I can't avoid a little retrospection here. We know what's going to happen. We know Spain and Portugal are going to lose their empires. They're going to lose their authoritarian regimes. They're going to become democracies. They're going to join this thing called the European Economic Community. They're going to join this thing called the European Union. They're going to have a kind of history, and they're going to join a kind of body which Ilyin could not have foreseen, namely Europe. So how do you then interpret Ilyin's thought in a world where there's a European Union? What the modern Eurasianists do is that they say Europe is the source of problems. The European Union is the source of problems. The European Union is decadent, right? Now you see all the language from 2012, 2013, which comes straight from Ilyin and from the 1920s and 1930s. The European Union becomes the source of all of these negative, artificial, you know, very often sexual ideas which are seeking to penetrate and to transform Russia. So the move that's made is to replace the European Union with Bolshevism. So there is no Bolshevism, but now everything which you have is the European Union. Okay, let me bring this to a conclusion. If this is true, right, What does this do? Well, it solves problems. I mean, ideologies work because they solve problems. It solves the problem of 2011. It's not, I think, a coincidence that when Putin, in addition to blaming it all on Hillary Clinton, right, Putin, when he's announcing his triumph, he cites Ivan Ilyin in December of 2011, which is the crucial moment of the suppression of Russian democracy. And what is the consequence of all of this? The consequence is that they not only begin to build a system which looks very Ilyin-like after 2011, but also they succeed in exporting the problems. And the crucial problem that they export is corruption. Okay? Because what is corruption? I mean, if you're thinking about the rule of law, Russia's a very corrupt state. I mean, it's down there with Ukraine and pretty much as low as you want to go. Sierra Leone, Bangladesh, that's the neighborhood. But if corruption is moral corruption, you can always say there are more gay people in the West, then it's all about sexuality, right? So there's a subtle, maybe not so subtle, there's an important change in the definition of what corruption is, so that corruption becomes a problem in the West rather than a problem in Russia. Then, of course, you see the source of the idea of Eurasia, and you also see the source of the blunders that Russia makes in Ukraine, right? You can really only understand Russia's policy in Ukraine, which was a whole series of miscalculations and blunders, if you accept, as Ilyin accepts, as Putin accepts, that there really isn't a Ukrainian people, right? Because so many of the things that happen, right, inside Ukraine, only like the protests, even like the war, which was largely an NGO effort, only makes sense if you accept that there's a Ukrainian society which does things without some kind of external stimulus, right? Which does in fact happen to be the case. And it's only if you think that just intervening in Ukraine is going to bring the whole state down because there really isn't a Ukraine, that the policy itself can seem to make a kind of sense. Of course, when you blunder into a war, you never ever say I blundered into a war. You always blame someone else. And Ilyin is very convincing and very useful here. At the end, right, when they annex Crimea, Putin gives a speech a few months later in which he says Crimea is Russia's Jerusalem, make of that what you will, and as the authority cites precisely Ilyin. But the point about Crimea is that that's the moment when they start saying that it's all about the Americans, right? That the Americans made us do this. We didn't have any choice. We had to do this because of the Americans, which is Ilyin. Maybe they get it somewhere else, but this idea that Russia is innocent no matter what it does, of which there are more spectacular examples, right? Like shooting down the Malaysian aircraft, right? When they shot down the Malaysian aircraft, which they did, they say, well, this was actually an assassination attempt on Putin, right? Which transforms like the real victims into Russia being the national victim, like immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean literally immediately, 3.5 hours after the event, it was already being reported on Russian television as an assassination attempt on the Russian head of state, right? We are innocent. No matter what we are doing, we are innocent, and it's the West's fault. Okay. Now, this also helps to explain, I think, something which is really important, which is the basic logic of Russian policy towards Ukraine. Russian policy towards Ukraine from the beginning has always been about Europe, and it has been openly characterized as being about Europe. The claim was that the Europeans were behind the Maidan, right? The claim that was made from Russia to Ukraine was that the Europeans are forcing their Western ideas upon you. When Russia tried to peel Ukrainians away from the protests, what they talked about was how things like, if you wanted free travel in the European Union, you had to first accept gay marriage, right? Things like this, right? This was the kind of propaganda they offered. And since then, I mean, literally since then, Russia has unfolded a policy against the European Union, I think of which Ukraine is only one part. When you invade Ukraine and you annex some of its territory, you're violating the fundamental norm of international law, right? That's fundamental, it shouldn't be forgotten. But in addition to that, we've had all kinds of other interesting things, like funding separatists and national populists inside the European Union, most prominently the Front National, like using media resources, especially RT, the big Russian television network, to support separatism and national populism inside European Union states. Like deliberately bombing the Syrians into Germany after Merkel made it clear that they would be accepted, and then manufacturing rape scandals involving Muslims inside Germany, which I think is particularly nasty, although not exceptional. This is all part, I think, of a general policy of treating the European Union as the fundamental foe, right, of Russian policy, which I think it is, and which is hard to explain without some kind of ideological framework. Now, in closing, I've tried in this very brief period to be fair to Ilyin. And I want to ask a question which is not historical, right? Because if I'm right and Ilyin has influenced Russia, that's, people take what they need from ideas. It doesn't have to be coherent or true or faithful. But let me just ask by way of a closing gesture, is the Russian elite actually being fair to Ilyin? Are they interpreting him in a way which is actually fair to his ideas? Because when you make the move of saying, it's not really Bolshevism that was the problem, it's the European Union that's the problem, you're actually doing something very fundamental, right? Because what Ilyin thought was that Bolshevism, although it came from the outside, had become a problem for Russia. And that Russia had to begin, when Russia was free, Russia had to begin with a self-investigation, right? Russia had to have a thoroughgoing decommunization, right? Russia had to have honest publication of historical documents and an honest discussion of the crimes of Bolshevism, on which he wrote bountifully, right? So all of the crimes which are now put in question by Russian memory policy, if there's a crime, it means that Ilyin wrote a whole book on it. And he was actually quite good, including on the famine in Ukraine, right? Ilyin wrote about all of these things and bountifully. And Ilyin also thought that the regeneration couldn't just involve blaming all of Russia's problems on other people. That it had to begin with Russia, and he proposed in his constitutional sketches decommunization, which involved a selection of who could and who couldn't take part in the new Russian state. Right. So, for example, KGB officers were not to be allowed to participate in the Russian state, which would mean that if Putin were going to take Ilyin literally, he would have to, rather than doing dramatic things like reburying him in the flowers and so on, he would have to resign from office. Now, I raise this as not just an ironic point, but partly as a serious point, because it comes down to the question of what this is all about in the end. From Ilyin's point of view, there had to be a renewal of Russia. There had to be a fascist period, but he saw it as a kind of purge, after which Russia would become some kind of right-wing rule of law state. What is happening now in Russia is not, to put it very briefly, is not that. There's no sense in which this is some kind of transitory period towards something else. What you see is what you get, right? And there's no sense in which, I think it's fair to say, there's no sense in which the Russian leaders are following Ilyin's basic guideline, which is that you have to be true and critical of yourself and not just of others. And I think that leads us to a point where the fundamental influence of Ilyin's geopolitical fascism is a kind of permanent war of disintegration on others, which has no endpoint, right? Which is really just about spreading anarchy, where there really isn't anything else. There's no final goal. That's just it for as long as it lasts. And this isn't a way of solving the problem of succession, but it's a very good way of distracting attention from it. And it's working for that for the time being. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Tim. My name's Tony Levitas. I'm a senior fellow at the Watson Institute, and I'll try and help along with taking questions, but I'm sure that Tim can handle this himself.
Okay, yeah, so if you wouldn't mind just saying your name and before you ask a question.
My name is Doug Blum, and I thought this was very interesting, provocative. I was feeling tired when I came here, and I'm woken up now, so it strikes me that you're ascribing to Putin a kind of a fervent, literal embrace of Ilyin's philosophy, as opposed to a more strategic acceptance of what he has to offer. I mean, after all, this is someone who has periodically accepted other right-wing nationalists. Dugin comes to mind until he was marginalized. A couple of days ago, he celebrated Zhirinovsky. So this is someone who, it seems to me, the more readily available and logical explanation is he strategically appeals to right-wing nationalists and Eurasianists as a way of cementing together a broad coalition of people who oppose the West, the Orthodox Church, and the moneyed elite. Why would you assume that he so literally is devoted to Ilyin specifically, that this is really, Putin's policy is an enactment of precise understanding and reading of Ilyin? That seems to me a bit far-fetched.
So I'm not, a couple things. The first is, I'm not assuming, right? I mean, as far as like one could give evidence of devotion to a dead philosopher. I mean, I challenge you, like even the American case where like we're all lovey-dovey about Thomas Jefferson and, you know, a Yale College just got named after Benjamin Franklin. I challenge you to think of a head of state devoting this much attention to a dead philosopher in the 21st century. It just doesn't happen that, you know, you get republished everything, you know, 25 volumes in huge editions, that you get reburied, that you get the flowers, that you get the march, that you get the blessing of the patriarch, right? That doesn't happen very often. And it makes me resist the idea that it's all calculated or strategic, because if it's calculated or strategic, you just kind of take what comes to hand, right? For example, living people. Living people are a lot easier to deal with, you know, than dead people in general. Because you can, for one thing, you can make them change their views if you need to. You can take them in and out of favor if you want to. Actually resuscitating a major dead philosopher strikes me as something which goes beyond the normal kinds of calculations that politicians make. I think it's actually an event of a different quality. The second is, and this is really interesting, I'm glad you mentioned Dugin, because where, you know, one can read this more or less worryingly, but where Dugin and Ilyin are different is that Ilyin is a serious thinker who is striving after some sort of consistency and who believes in truth, right? So it's very easy, you know, from my liberal perspective or other liberal perspectives to mock or to make fun of like this little bit of Hegelianism or this like dialectical trick. It's an easy game to play, and I indulged in it a little bit. But Ilyin as a philosopher is seriously after the truth, and you cannot engage him without seeing the earnestness of it. I mean, the sheer industry of the man, right? He wrote 40 books, half of them in German, half of them in Russian. Dugin is not like that, right? So Dugin, who is the most important contemporary Eurasianist philosopher, Dugin is not like that. Fundamentally, he is in the camp of not believing that things are true. Or maybe even deep down, like there's some sentimental bone in Dugin somewhere which thinks that there's truth. But in practice, the way he operates is that it's this postmodern mode, right, where it's all just nonsense, it's all just propaganda. You have to understand that it's all just propaganda, and our propaganda is our propaganda, right? But he never actually pursues truth or makes serious truth claims. And for that reason, he's kind of ridiculous in a way that Ilyin is not, right? But it's an important distinction because I think a lot hangs on, I mean, maybe I'm wrong and maybe Ilyin doesn't matter and maybe Dugin doesn't matter, but let's assume for a minute that these characters might matter. If Ilyin matters, that means that you might actually be convinced of a kind of structural picture of the world where Russia really is always innocent and the West really is always guilty. And I mean, I confess, like when I listen to Putin's Valdai speeches and so on, it really is striking how they've gone more and more in that direction since 2005. If you believe in Dugin, you're basically capable of believing anything, right? Because he will shift, he will move, he will turn. You know, right now, sure, he says that, you know, let me tell you about the West. The West is where Lucifer fell. The West is the source of all evil conceivable, right? Does he really mean that? Is it possible to take him 100% seriously when he says that? I don't think anyone does. You know, I don't think he does either. And so a lot hangs on this because there are some people, and I'm moving towards them myself, who think that Putin does actually have some kind of worldview, right? And that all the chaos is a function of the worldview. And then there are other people, like Peter Pomerantsev, who wrote a brilliant book, who are more of the view that it's all smoke and mirrors and there's nothing there, right? And so if it's Dugin, it's the latter, for sure. And then what else I want to say about this? I guess the third thing I would say is that even if, like, so let's say you're right, and it's like Dugin and Zhirinovsky, these people are all getting their concepts from Ilyin, right? I mean, they're warping them, they're abusing them, they're simplifying them, right? But they're getting them from the 1920s and 1930s anyway, and so like even in kind of a minimal case, you'd want to take this seriously. Yes, please.
So my question, just a very basic one, maybe because I don't understand fascism very well. Why not monarchy? You know, if you have this view that you just described, it seems like the anointing of the leader by God, you know, in a traditional monarchical way, it solves your succession problem. What's the point of having a leader with a capital L who emerges in some mysterious way without that kind of traditional apparatus?
Right. Okay, so let me answer that question in three ways. The first is where I start, and I mean this very seriously, I'm starting with Russia's current problems. So no matter how elegant or interesting I might find Ilyin, I think he only matters, and in a way it goes back to your question as well, I think he only matters, so to speak, objectively, insofar as he provides solutions to real problems. And by solution, I don't necessarily mean like a desirable solution, but I mean a day-to-day solution. And Ilyin solves the problem of succession the way you solve it in fascism, which is you say, it's not really a problem. Leaders just come, mysteriously from nowhere in a poof of smoke, like Mussolini does in 1922, and that's how things work. And Ilyin says that's justified and necessary because there are exceptional moments, right? Like the Bolshevik Revolution, and the only way to fight those exceptional moments is by an exceptional moment of your own. And so if you think that like the next prince or the legally elected president is going to solve this problem for you, you're completely wrong. It has to be someone who comes in on the white horse, with the sword, with the blazing sword of God in his hand. It has to be like that. So so there's a real problem, which is almost a technical problem in Russia, which is what on earth is going to come next. And then the way you solve the technical problem is by making it a metaphysical problem, and also by making it someone else's problem, by trying to make Europe much more like you. Okay, so why not the Tsar? Okay, let me again answer that from the point of view of Putin and from the point of view of Ilyin. From the point of view of Putin, there isn't a royal family which people accept, and even if there were, I don't think the people who are around Putin would let that royal family last very long in a meaningful sense. So it's not a practical solution for Russia to bring back whoever the Romanov heir might pretend to be. Ilyin was more interesting about this. Ilyin was in principle a monarchist, but what he said was, we're in an exceptional moment. And the thing about exceptional moments is they have a tendency of lasting for a really long time, right? I mean, Bolshevik rule in Russia, Soviet rule lasts for 69 years. He says, yes, there should be a czar, and we should have the rule of law, but for the time being, necessity requires us to have this leader. It's either this leader or nothing else, right? In these conditions. So. From my point of view, the succession problem is really fundamental because I'm looking at this I'm happy to admit this, from a Western point of view where what I worry about is the rule of law in the remainder of the world, right? I worry about this acid bath that we're being dropped into, which we are, right? This is all very close to us. So, I mentioned, when you think of it, much closer than we think, right? So when you think about the Ukraine crisis, and you think about Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine during the revolution, who was tossed out. Yanukovych was a man who was very close to the Kremlin, who basically gave the Kremlin all of Ukraine's national security secrets, who hived out the wealth of his country, stole an unbelievable amount of it, managed to suppress all the other oligarchs, right? Leaves his country literally as protesters are being shot in the street after he fails to impose a dictatorship. Why am I saying all of this? Because his main political advisor was Paul Manafort, who is also the main political advisor of Donald Trump, right? So this cycle of influence, right, whatever ideas it involves, is actually really closely, because there's a succession principle issue right there, that we're facing. So it's all much closer than we think, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of obsessed with it. Yes, sir.
I'm Maxim Boyko. I'm a senior fellow here at Watson, originally from Russia, although I have a
Can you speak a little louder?
Yes, I'm saying my name is Maxim Boyko. I'm a senior fellow here, originally from Russia, although I have a Ukrainian name. I think that just following on the first question, following up a little bit, what is the critical evidence that you see that you make you think about Putin as ideological, whether his ideology comes from Ilyin or Dugin or someone else? What's wrong with the, I would say, simpler model of thinking about Putin as an authoritarian who wants to, protect, control, prolong his power? I mean, what are the events in Ukraine that you believe do not fit this somewhat simpler model, in which, of course, Ilyin, Dugin, whoever may pop up as useful propaganda tools, but propaganda and ideology are very different.
Okay, so let me start where you ended. First of all, Ilyin does not figure in propaganda, right? This is very important. Putin does not go on for the West anyway. He does right, but that's not for us, right? I'm sorry.
And they do documentaries on him as well.
Yeah, no, he's been revived. I'm trying to make a distinction between Ilyin as saying no one says, maybe I'm wrong, but no one says Russia's great because of Ilyin, right? I mean, I think Ilyin is in a much more intimate position where Ilyin is there to show that we have this important philosopher who justifies the things that we're doing, which is, I mean, maybe a kind of propaganda, but I think to dismiss it as propaganda would be to miss an important point. Because whether or not, Putin is directly influenced by these ideas, you're doing something different when you revive a figure and hold him close to you than when you just throw out ideas that are just propaganda, right? Because propaganda, I mean, the Russian version of propaganda, as you know better than me, tends to take a much more brutal form where it doesn't actually require dead goated conservative philosophers from Switzerland. It just doesn't usually require that. They're not usually needed. But I mean, then to go to the beginning of your question, I would resist the either or. I would resist really strongly the either or, that we have to say either there's ideology or he's just practical. I just don't think anyone, including leaders, is either just practical or driven by ideas. I think the two fit together in one way or another, and that even your account of what you're doing yourself as a leader depends upon concepts which bring together the data or bring together the experience, and that's a thing we call ideology. I'm not saying that ideology is just there, like some kind of bauble that influences him, right? It's not like remote control. I'm saying that I think it solves some political problems and that it gives them a language that brings things together. So Ukraine, you mentioned, so the middle part of your question is about Ukraine. These things, as I tried to caution, you can't prove these things, but it seems to me that the way they talked about Ukraine and even the moves they made in Ukraine had a lot to do with some assumptions about Europe being behind everything and about Ukraine itself not having agency, which, I mean, you can correct me if you disagree, but I think a lot more Russians hold those views now than did 5 years ago, right? I mean, right now we're getting close to the point where a Russian is somebody who will tell you that Ukraine doesn't exist, which 5 years ago wasn't true, right? Or even 10 years ago wasn't true, but now it's reached a real extreme. So I mean, the way I tried to pitch it in the talk is in terms of mistakes, right? Because if you're just a rational I don't think there is such thing as a rational, calculating authoritarian leader, but if there were, you then have to explain the mistakes. And I think they made mistakes in Ukraine. I mean, I think in late November 2013, they did not think that Ukrainians would massively protest the association agreement, right? If you look at whatever Glaziov's Twitter account or whatever your preferred source of information is, they were rejoicing when Ukraine didn't sign the association agreement, right? And then when there were the protesters, they all went quiet for a couple of days because they didn't know what to say. And what they did was then they gave Yanukovych money to put down the protests, which also backfired totally and led to a revolution, which I also think they didn't want. So I think they actually made mistakes. And part of what I'm trying to do is to suggest that an ideology solves some problems for you, and then it makes other problems. And like the problems that are solved and the problems that are created is maybe one way of sussing out, of extracting, what the important ideas actually are. Yes, please.
I have a couple of points. I mean, I agree with you. I think this is all interesting, doing this genealogy of Russian fascism. It's really important right now. I think one of the problems I have with the way you're approaching is that I don't think that you can really sort of have everything run through Ilyin as a funnel. And if you really want to go about doing this, you have to go back to the 19th century, you have to go back to the Slavophile movement, and you can see elements in that play in politics now. I mean, there's the emphasis on personalization or personality as the main factor in human state or even communal relations. There's the skepticism in that of abstractions like law, that you find in the West, right? And all of these things end up dovetailing with fascism when that comes around, right? But I think in some ways it's important to think about that, not so much so we can try and figure out what Putin thinks, but it's more important for trying to figure out why Putin happens, right? Because this isn't just Putin, this is Russian culture, right? So why do you have excessive personalization in politics, which is one of the things that makes the whole question of the state in Russia so ambiguous, right? To my mind, at least. And I mean, so that's one point. The second point, and I think it's been kind of hinted at here, is that if you study a lot of these fascist thinkers, the contemporary ones, many of them identify Putin with the state, right? And that a lot of the currents in Russian fascism don't identify with the state. Like Sobornist Slavophiles identify with Narod, with the people, right? So then you have all this, these complicated questions of representation. How does the people appear, right? This is really one of the million-dollar questions here, right? And the final thing, which I mean, when we talk about Ilyin from the 20s and then we get to Putin in the 21st century, we skip over the whole Soviet experience. And this is something that I think you have to take into consideration if you're talking about the succession question, because this is another legacy that you have to deal with succession. You have the example of the Politburo and the Communist Party after Stalin, right? I don't think that Putin has eliminated, just said we're not going to answer the succession question. It's just become ambiguous. But this is also another possibility. If Putin dies tomorrow, you get another cadre, right? Who knows? I mean, the Kremlin is completely opaque about this, so you don't really know what's going to happen. But that's another alternative, right?
Yeah,
so you have this fascist, conservative, 19th century, early 20th century, but you have to include the Soviet, which is part of Putin.
Look.
in that as well.
Look, I'm happy to concede that other things are going on besides the ones I talked about in my 45-minute speech. I can only, like, if you in a talk, you can only really do one thing, and the one thing I was trying to do was to insert a thinker who I think is A, interesting, B, has been revived, and C, might actually give us some causal purchase on what's going on in the world. I accept all of your points, right? But I just don't think any of them particularly change the argument. With the Slavophiles, yeah, of course with the Slavophiles, there's an awful lot going on in Russian intellectual life where one can trace genealogies. There are very important cases like Pushkin, where like they run through Ilyin, right, back through Ilyin, and then into the 19th century. That's all certainly true. Nevertheless, I think it's okay and legitimate to try to suggest that there might be one figure, and I think there is only one, who was completely forgotten in Russia, right? I mean, it's not just that Putin hadn't heard of him. It's that when in the early 1990s, when Ilyin was revived, almost nobody in Russia had any idea who he was, and now pretty much everybody who has any kind of political consciousness knows who Ilyin is or has some kind of idea. That's special. That doesn't happen all that often, that someone who's a zero, right, who's gone in the culture comes back and becomes important. And so if you're right, in a serious treatment, I would then put that inside the context of a lot of other things that are going on, which likewise with the fascists. So I completely agree with you, right? I mean, much of the fascist movement, if not most of it, in Russia is actually anti-Putin. And all I'm trying to claim is that the geopolitics, which we see, I think, emanating, like this fundamental idea, which I see as like the normative race to the bottom, where we can't solve our domestic problems, but we're going to make sure you can't either, right? And then we're going to race you to the bottom, and you're going to hit first. That could just be a tactic, right? I mean, it could just be a tactic, but maybe it's a tactic which is easier to implement and makes you, and is somehow more elegant or more attractive to the people who have to carry it out if it's embedded in this idea, which Ilyin gives you, which is that evil comes from the outside. Maybe that's significant. So with the fascists, I completely agree. It's just that what I'm trying to look at in particular is what's being read in the Kremlin, who's being cited by the head of state, which is different from the fascists. Right after Putin dies, we might learn more about what those folks think. And of course, there are various flavors, and fascism is a spectrum. And then let's see. The final point was succession. No, here I completely agree with you. It's just that I think the problem is just sharpened, right? I mean, I think the problem now of succession is so unbelievably sharp because the communists had a real serious problem with succession. And there was no rule, and every time there was a drama, which often involved people being killed, the problem is worse without a communist party, right? I mean, okay, admittedly one exists, but it's no longer in power. So you don't have a Politburo, right? There's no longer a normal pool of candidates. And then Ilyin himself even makes it sharper because, because what he's doing is he's legitimating the no-party situation, right? No-party rule. I mean, okay, there's United Russia, but that's not a party in a meaningful fascist sense. If you have a fascist party, then at least you have, and I'm not advocating this by any means, but then at least you have like a Himmler and a Goering, and you can argue about who's number two, right? The current Russian situation doesn't really have even that, So I think that the communist point just makes it stronger because I think they've reached a kind of nadir of the succession problem.
It's coming out, I think, later this summer. Zygatov's book, recent. It's a short history of contemporary Russia. It's called All the Kremlin's Men, and Putin is this sort of black hole or sort of dark star.
Yeah.
But the whole book is written around different figures in the Kremlin. It's a very different approach, I think. It's worth checking out, just if you're thinking about it in the sense of, like, what about, maybe we're personalizing it too much, and maybe there are all these other forces in the Kremlin that we don't see.
Yeah, I mean, my take on, I should move on to another question, but I mean, my take on Putin, which is not as informed as many others, is that he is indispensable precisely because he's at the center, right? If you want the black hole or the solar system model. And the question is, who else could possibly be at the center and preserve the kind of stability we're used to? I mean, again, the concern comes with, if you follow the no civil society model, and you follow the idea that political parties shouldn't exist, and you do what Putin is now doing, which is build up a plurality, the only pluralism you have is a pluralism of security institutions, that then sets up what the succession struggle is going to be like. You know, the scenario I worry about is that these people who you're talking about will be at the head of 3 or 4 different security organizations who are going to be fighting it out. And that's, you know, that's I fear that's what we're left with. Anyway.
I want to jump in on the back of this and ask the question from the other side, which is the same question that you, is what extra purchase does imputing to Putin some sort of coherent ideology give us for looking forward as opposed to looking back? Because that's the big stake,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, so this is the part of the talk where, so I had a funny conversation with Masha Gessen in Chicago a year or so ago, where she was asked to predict Russia's future. And she said, you know, this is awkward for me because I've made a number of predictions that were wrong, right? And then I said, this is awkward for me because I've made a number of predictions that were right, right? And when you make predictions that are right, then your problem is that you don't want to break your streak. But so what I want to say is that, like, starting from where I'm starting here, because this Eileen thing has been in my mind, right? I've been following this for a while, even though I haven't been writing about it, I haven't written about it yet. Following with this stuff, I predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine, where I was all alone, and, like, believe me, like, the level of mockery from colleagues was extraordinary, right? I predicted Russia would invade Ukraine at a time when the consensus was many things will happen, but there's not going to be an invasion. And the reason I predicted it was because I could see that they were on this trajectory where they thought that it was just external force and there wasn't really any Ukrainian structure or society there, which is a basic miscalculation, and it led them into places where they didn't expect to be going. I also made some other predictions that were correct. Like, I predicted during the Ukrainian stuff in early 2014, this is admittedly a bit more amorphous, but that this would turn out to be mainly about the European Union, and that we were going to see, as time passed, that Russia was supporting the far right inside the European Union, which is now common knowledge, right? Everybody now says that. But I actually formulated that as a prediction in early 2014. And another thing that I did was I predicted that Putin, this is very obscure, you know, and kind of risky, but I predicted that Putin would rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the 20th century is exhibit A of how all things are permitted, right? How you can do anything, you know. So I said that he would, and then he did, you know. And I like to think he didn't do it because I predicted it, right? But it was a very specific prediction, and it followed from what I was reading of what Putin was saying, and I got it right. So, I mean, what I'm trying to suggest is that we haven't had a whole lot of perspectives on Putin, which have given us a lot of predictive power, and that maybe, just maybe, you know, the fact that looking at it this way has generated correct predictions might be another reason to take it seriously. My prediction then is that the struggle against the European Union cannot end. If sanctions are ended tomorrow, I do not think they stop funding Marine Le Pen. If sanctions are ended tomorrow, I do not think they stop putting Farage on RT to talk about how the European Union is terrible. I think they don't stop inviting the Nazis of Europe to St. Petersburg for their annual conferences. I think if sanctions stop tomorrow, all that stuff continues, because the problem with Europe is fundamentally a domestic problem for Russia. The existence of Europe is a domestic problem for Russia, and where the ideology helps is it explains that that's normal. It's normal that your domestic problems are actually the fault of Europe. So the prediction would be that so long as Putin is in power, they're not going to stop trying to undo the European Union.
Some points, and admittedly, some of this I believe has been touched upon already.
So let's touch on the part that hasn't been touched on already.
Peter, Stalin, Khrushchev did not have successors, and yet the Consulati, or whatever it was at the time of Peter, and the Presidium sorted things out in their own way, not without a certain amount of instability at the time. This goes back to what you're saying initially, that Russia, since it didn't have a succession principle, or something that I guess would be a Western organized succession principle, is not at stake. And then you brought up the 2011 preparations, election preparations, when Putin becomes, again, is elected for his third term, having served as a premier. And who knows what's going to happen after 2020, after his fourth term as president ends, but maybe in the case of 1425, the onset of the Muscovite Civil War, the first one in 1598, when the Rurikovic dynasty collapses, and then again in 1917, lack of a succession principle, a firm succession principle, really throws things into an uproar. I think there, the argument has some validity. We'll see what happens with Putin, with his FDS guys and the rest of his Soviet, whether they can sort things out. But I'm not sure I can go so far as to agree with you that Russia, therefore, is not a state.
Okay.
Second, and I don't know offhand, but is Pareto and Mussolini, are they being read at all in Russia? Are they being published?
So succession, I mean, you've hit upon a current obsession of mine, but even though I find it to be the central issue in contemporary Russia, I didn't actually claim that Russia is not a state as a result. My claim was that in all of the entities we're talking about, the statehood is in some sense incomplete, and that statehood is a kind of question rather than an answer. And that's how I set things up, because I'm trying to, it goes to this question and all of these questions. I'm trying to explain why it is that ideology matters, or how ideology could have this ideology could have some kind of hold. And the answer is that fascism doesn't have problem with this kind of fluidity, right? That you from a fascist point of view, such as Eileen's or others, you could be comfortable with not having a succession principle, because your idea of leadership is that the leader just comes in somewhere off stage, right? You can be comfortable with European orders rising and falling. You take for granted that's going to happen. So that was part of like the preliminary argumentation for why, in this particular world that we're in, a fascist idea might help to make things make sense. As far as like the Russian history, I mean, since you mentioned it, it is actually extraordinary how much of a problem this has been for Russia all along, right? So when to give the example of Putin's Crimea speech, he talks about Vladimir, and how he was baptized in Crimea, which is not actually probably the case. But the thing I find so interesting about that is like this notion that Russia goes back to Kiev and Rus, is like that's just as true as whatever America goes back to Birmingham. But it's kind of true and it's kind of not. But the interesting thing is that when he cites Vladimir and Kiev and Rus, that was a state which had serious succession problems, right? I mean, there's this whole myth in Russian and Ukrainian historiography that the problem was the Mongols came in 1241. No, that was not the problem. By 1241, they were already totally fragmented into countless little states, and they were spending all of their time fighting each other. And when the Mongols came, like literally on the way to engage the Mongols, the Ruthenian princes fought themselves on the way to fight the Mongols, right? And then when Muscovy is set up, as everyone who does Russian history knows, their own succession principles, such as they were, which involved like going down the brothers instead of going from father to son, in order for the Mongols to set up rule in Russia, they deliberately violated those principles, such as they were, so that whatever principles there were no longer operated in Muscovy, right? So this isn't the case that I was making, but I actually do find it interesting that the very attempt to refer back to ancient Russian history actually reveals like this unending, boiling, surplus of succession problems, which they don't actually ever get sorted out satisfactorily, I don't think.
Can I maybe just,
There are a bunch of people who want to ask questions, and I'm taking a lot of time. So let me see if we run out, let's come back. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. It's very interesting, Michael Kennedy. Just two brief questions. Does it matter the process by which Ilyine becomes significant for your argument? And then secondly, does it matter the ways in which certain parts of Ilyine's philosophy are embraced and others are diminished for your argument?
Can you I mean, I think you have something in mind. Can you be more explicit?
On which side? On both of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for instance, if we were able to trace how Ilyine becomes significant to Putin ultimately, does it matter the network by which it came? And for your argument, which would have implications therefore for how is this satisfying some kind of network besides having ideological effect.
Okay.
And then on the other hand, the points that you were making about the ideology suggesting that Russia cannot be aggressive. Wow, that's
Sorry?
that Russia cannot be aggressive, that all wars are
Okay.
defensive.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great ideology when you invade Crimea, right?
Right.
But are there other things that are not so convenient that might be part of the larger philosophy that are suppressed, and with what consequence would those contradictions come?
So yeah, both of those questions are at the margin of what I think I can contemplate now. On the first one, I am making, as I think you're identifying, I'm taking the easy road by pointing out how Putin himself cites Ilyin and how he cites him at critical moments. So 2011, which was actually the parliamentary elections, he cites Ilyin. The Crimea speech, the one about Jerusalem, he closes it by citing Ilyin. So here I'm short-circuiting, right? I'm just saying, well, look, the person at the top quotes him in these highly ceremonial and politically charged moments, so therefore it must matter. And partly I'm doing that because we just don't know much about the mechanism, right? Like there is actually a Kremlin reading circle, and they did in fact read Ilyin, I have on quite good authority. But who and what they said, it's going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to know. And it's not like the old Sovietological method of like counting how many times people quote which thing from Marx. The guys at the top are free in a way that people weren't in the Soviet Union. So it's very hard to to do those kinds of things. You have to be, I think, almost personally closer to the system than I am. So I think it does matter. But I mean, I would it goes back to a little bit to this question, but I would be personally content if I demonstrated that it's affected Putin in the way he makes sense of the world, because how the system actually works beyond that is really, really, really murky. Again, going back to your question about the Siloviki, where the head the head of the security apparatus was just changed a few days ago, right? He's gone now. Okay, so then on the parts and how they're left out, yeah, I mean, for me, the critical move is how you define the European contagion. And that contagion language is Ilyin's. I mean, Ilyin has this moment, which is really interesting, where he's trying to explain in the 1920s why fascism didn't come from Russia, but instead had to come from Italy, and then later Germany as a problem. Because his view is that Russia should have been the best incubator for fascism, so why not Russian fascism? Why? And his answer is that Russia is so perfectly innocent and good that the microbes, again his language, the microbes of the Enlightenment were able to infect the Russian social body, right, with Bolshevism. Because Russia precisely was so innocent of Western history and so untouched, it didn't have what he called the immune defenses against these Western microbes, and that's his excuse, as it were, for why Russia isn't the first fascist power. So for him it's a problem, right, because he wants to say that the white movement in Russia was actually the seedbed or the founding energy of fascism as a whole, but it doesn't succeed precisely because of Russia's innocence. But anyway, the key question is, what do you think the contagion is? And I think what I think has happened is that they've taken the easy way out by saying, I mean, and as you always do or often, by saying that the existing European Union is the contagion, right? The gay rights, all this stuff, that's the contagion, that's the decadence, which is the word they use, which is also in Ilyin. But what Ilyin might just have said, who knows, right? But what Ilyin might just have said is that you should first be dealing with Bolshevism, that Bolshevism is in Russia, and you can't do anything further until you've dealt with Bolshevism. I mean, that is in fact what he said. And so he advocated all kinds of historical research and decommunization, including, as I mentioned at the end, that KGB officers and members of the Communist Party shouldn't be allowed to hold political positions in post-communist Russia, right? So, I mean, ignoring that part has obvious implications. But, I mean, philosophically, more seriously, Ilyin's notion of regeneration involved personal, moral regeneration. It involved accepting that the world was evil, but, I mean, so remember, he's in this phenomenological, which means existential tradition. So accepting that the world is dark and that the dominant forces are evil, individuals have to struggle against that and try to remake them. That part of the philosophy, which Ilyin himself did embody, I mean, he was unlikable in all kinds of ways, and no one liked him, which is one of the reasons why he was forgotten, right? It's one of these, like, I mean, that's a bit of an intellectual story I'm confident about. You know, if people like you, it's much more likely that you're going to be remembered because people will make nice speeches about you and they'll write, you know, necrologues or whatever we call them. People will write about you, they'll collect your letters and so on. Everyone hated Ilyin because all the immigrants hated him because they thought he was so self-righteous and so judgmental and so polemical, all of which is 100% completely true. But my point is that he really was a morally rigid person, right? With some, you know, with a couple exceptions, but he was a morally rigid person. He was a very judgmental person, but he was consistent. You know, he worked extremely hard, right? He was virtuous in the ways he wanted people to be virtuous. That part, right? The moral rigidity, that part has gone completely missing, right? It's Ilyin has been used entirely as a way to export responsibility. Yeah.
One last question, yes?
Is it?
Hi, I'm Anna Lisinska. So I just have a question, just to question your premise that this ideology is due to Ilyin. It seems to me, having grown up in the Soviet Union, that this whole mysterious Russian soul and this whole attitude of Russia is completely innocent, that was already the ideology. And when they rediscovered Ilyin, they thought, okay, now it's conveniently written down.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have a take on that.
No, I mean, one of the reasons why it was so easy to skip through the whole heart and soul, the whole, like, you know, Serce and Duch business, is that it is completely mainstream, right? And in a way, that's something that I should have said in response to Slavophile question, is that it's not that Ilyin is like breaking new ground at every point, but he does put things together in a way that's sometimes new and comfortable. So if Russia, let's say Russians have big souls, let's grant that the Russians have the big souls, you can conclude, the Slavophile conclusion from that is usually something like, we should be left alone to develop our own unique something or other, right? Whereas the Eurasian take on that is more like, we have the big souls, therefore we've developed the better fascism, but everyone else is also going to develop fascism, right? And we should interact with them while they do it, which is a different conclusion. And so, you know, what Ilyin does with the heart and the soul is that he develops up a kind of geopolitics, which says, we have to protect ourselves against those evil European forces so long as they're going after our big souls with their reason, right? I mean, he says reason is the enemy. So long as they're going after our big souls with their reason, with their minds, you know, we have to fight them. But it's also possible that they will move closer to us, which is a different point. So you get a geopolitics from it. A lot of what he says is in Pushkin. I mean, a lot of what he says, and he idolizes Pushkin. You know, and Pushkin pioneers this thing in the 19th century of no matter what we're doing, I mean, no matter how many, you know, no matter how far we go into Poland and how many Polish uprisings we suppress, right? It's always their fault, or maybe the Ukrainians' fault. You know, it's definitely not our fault that we're here in Warsaw putting down this uprising. It's definitely the Poles' fault. You know, and Pushkin goes very far with this, but also in the Caucasus. He's very good at, like, there's this thing about a Russian prisoner, and like the one Russian prisoner therefore makes all of Russia innocent, despite whatever it might be doing in the Caucasus. All very useful. Pushkin has a big fight with Mickiewicz about this over the Poles. And Ilyin loves that. You know, it goes back to this thing. Like, Ilyin loves that, and he cites it, and he writes about it. So of course you're right, but it's a question of how you turn that into a geopolitics, and what kind of geopolitics it is. Because the Russians with the big souls, that's been going on forever, I grant. But until quite recently, there wasn't this thing about how the Ukrainians didn't have the big souls. And there also wasn't, right? That's new. The Ukrainians have had big souls until very recently. And there also wasn't this business about how decadence and homosexuality and all this stuff is coming in from Europe, right? That's fairly new, at least at this volume level. So something's happened.
Thank you very much.